full of financial services folks, which is interesting, and a little bit of data and IT as well, which is great to see. Another data person joining. The real thing that blew me away on the registrants was just the breadth of industry groups that were represented. So there's 31, and a large group of construction, communications, professional services. Really interesting to see all that. So for today, we're going to do things a little bit different than our other presentations in the past because this is a non-CPE format. So we're going to go through some things, try to give you some ideas, and save a quarter or third of the presentation for your questions at the end. So as you have questions, please go ahead and start putting those into the chat window. And we're going to cover a little bit of what we've seen from COVID before and after. We're going to talk about your journey as a data-driven organization. And I would like to start there by reminding everybody that data is a journey. And so whether you're taking your very first steps or you're nearing the pinnacle, there's always a next step, and there's always somebody who's ahead of you and behind you on that path. And we'd like to help give you some ideas to help you along that path. We're going to go over a couple of case studies we found particularly interesting in the current environment about visual analytics and operational monitoring. And again, we'll have questions at the end. Now, if you can, please remember back to February. And I realize that not everybody may be able to remember back that far. So here's a few highlights. There was an Iran missile strike. They shot down a 737. Australia was on fire. There was an impeachment and acquittal. Kobe Bryant's helicopter crash. There was Brexit and a Taliban peace deal. And that was just January and February. And if you lived in the greater Seattle area, there was also a century-level flood, which isn't super common. And then COVID-19 hit the stage. And so if you think, man, February seems like a long time ago, well, lots happened since then. And if you're like us, you probably heard the phrase, the new normal, plenty enough time. So we're going to try to just scrap that right now and avoid saying it again. But it was really impressive, and I really appreciate Scott Klosky from Future Point of View saying earlier this week that it's not helpful to think of 2019 as the last normal year because that doesn't help you move forward. And so what we'd like to do is to help you move forward by thinking about how the current environment affects your business in general and data in particular. And the largest shift we've seen so far in business has largely been around how businesses communicate and leverage the data that they have. And so if you think again back to our February thought experiment, back in February or January, if you had a question and you needed a technical answer and you maybe needed to produce a report with that answer, a lot of times you could look around your office and see who's busy, who's available, who you thought would have time. And you may send specifications to them on email, but you had that option to get together with them face to face and help them work through the problems and solutions and get access to the information. And if you fast forward to a more recent time, a lot more of that communication is going to be going over a chat. There's going to be a lot more email involved. There's going to be a number of situations where you're going to have to find a time to get everybody together into a Zoom meeting or a WebEx like this, and then you're going to try to get to working on the solution collaboratively online. So either using something like Office 365 or emailing the files back and forth. And eventually you're going to end up with the answer, of course. But for every step in the process now that we move to a more distributed work environment, it just takes a little bit more time. There's a little bit of friction in the system. And so what this really highlights is a couple of important things. It highlights the importance of having a good data system, and it also highlights the importance of having good data in your system to support your business. And what that allows is for you to have one source of truth, which is really important when people are in different places, because it kind of eliminates the scenario where so-and-so had this file on their laptop and now we can't get a hold of them. By adding these more centralized and more automated systems, it gives you one place to go look for things. And having that also gives you the ability to answer ad hoc or emergency questions or new questions a lot more quickly. And we'll dive into that a little bit more later in the presentation, but right now I'd like to turn it over to Angelo, who's going to talk about your path to becoming a data-driven organization.
Thanks, Aaron. Could you go ahead and pass me the presenter ball, please? Thank you. All right, yeah, thanks, Aaron. So the past few months have certainly changed a whole lot about the way we all do business and how we approach doing business day to day. Many of us who have been fortunate enough to transition at least somewhat effectively to a more remote work situation have likely become acutely aware of the reliance that our organizations truly have on all of our digital tools and our digital infrastructure, right? So one of the foundational components of an effective virtual or digital strategy in this distributed work environment is your information. Information or data is something that you can think of as one of your company's most valuable assets. And as Aaron highlighted, the ability to be able to find that information and insights on your own without having to have personal interactions with your coworkers, right now, that is no more important than it ever was. But the blind spots that our organizations have in being able to sort of democratize data and make it easily accessible for everyone who needs it, those gaps and shortcomings have become a lot more apparent against the backdrop of our current business environment. What I'd like to do right now is talk to you all about what it means to be a data-driven organization. We'll talk a little bit about what the characteristics of a fully data-driven organization are. And then I want to get into, at a very high level, some steps you can take now to move your organization down the road of becoming more fully data-driven. So at the core of every data-driven organization is a philosophy that data should drive all of your decisions. Broadly speaking, there are kind of two primary ways that data are used in day-to-day operations. The first is through the lens of the known, or what has happened. So when you consume information this way, these are things like your monthly business reviews, or when you have an analyst run an ad hoc report to see, factually, how something performed or how a particular event unfolded. If your company is in a mature state on your journey toward being a data-driven organization, you may already have a suite of live reports or dashboards that give you real-time information. Maybe they send you alerts when key performance indicators skew outside of an acceptable range. You may also have direct access to curated data sets that will allow you to interrogate data and answer specific questions that you might have in real time. The reason I'm giving you some of these examples is because I'm trying to show you that there are varying levels of sophistication in how you consume known or historical information. But the common thread across all of these is that the information you're consuming here is concrete. So assuming that you have proper data validation and integrity controls in place, then when you consume historical information, it's pretty much like studying history, right? The facts are the facts. The second way that we consume data is through a more sophisticated analytic lens. So when we talk about analytics, we're talking about applying statistical methods to both answer the questions about what and why things have happened, right? Those are what we refer to as descriptive and diagnostic analytics when you're looking at the past. And then we also use analytics to help us sort of understand what is most likely to happen in the future. That would be predictive analytics. There's also another class of analytics that helps us understand how we can most impact those future likelihoods. And those are called prescriptive analytics. So what this analytic way of consuming data also has several levels of sophistication. For example, if you're using known seasonality in combination with known or assumed rates of change, that's kind of a common way to update forecasts or set your budgets. That's analytics. Those are analytics that predict the future just as much as multivariable regression analyses, which will automatically update your forecasts and projects in real time based on transactional data that's flowing through the system. These are all analytics, again, at varied degrees of sophistication. So however sophisticated your methods are, the real key to being a data-driven organization lies in the culture. It's the idea that using data to answer questions is a foundational component of everyday work. Every employee in a data-driven organization starts from the data around what happened. And they look at that, they examine that information, and they begin to ask questions when they see issues or problems that can't be easily explained. From there, they're going to develop hypotheses and use analytics to test those hypotheses and ultimately drive action. Oops. So when we here at Moss Adams think of a data-driven organization, we like to look at it through the lens of what we call the 5 pillars of a data-driven organization. If you've seen our Becoming a Data-Driven Organization webcast, you're likely familiar with this 5 pillars concept. And kind of a side note, if you haven't seen that, I do highly recommend it, as it's going to get to a much deeper level of detail here than I am today. But just kind of going over those 5 pillars, the first pillar is data infrastructure. And this refers to how members of your organization are able to access information. Some examples of data infrastructure are like if you had a portal that grants your employees access to a data store or data warehouse where they can easily get the data they need. That would be an example of kind of an emergent or perhaps even optimized data infrastructure pillar. On the flip side, if you're still starting out on your data-driven journey, you may have a data infrastructure that gets data to your employees via something like a ticket system. Maybe they have to send an email request or submit a ticket to your IT team and wait for an IT analyst to run a report and then email it back or put it on a shared drive, right? These are all characteristics that help define the maturity of your data infrastructure pillar. And again, you're kind of at a varying degree of sophistication depending on where you assess yourself to be. Pillar 2 is what we refer to as curated information. This speaks to how reliable the available information is. So do measures mean the same thing across all of your functional teams? One place where we commonly see this is when you're looking at financial measures across organizations. For example, if you have a marketing team that's trying to tell a stakeholder how much a marketing promotion might have cost in a prior month, let's say February. Maybe this promotion ran into the first 2 or 3 days of March, and they're trying to get around the cost of that promotion for the month of February. Is the cost number and the ways in which they're defining how to capture that going to generate the same expense number as, say, your accounting or finance team based on what the accounting cutoffs are for those dates? Where we've seen this curated information piece headline is when we see that those numbers are not consistent. Something like expense can mean something completely different to another team. A sale or when a sale happened can be something completely different between the functional organizations that are looking at it. So when we talk about curated information, we're talking about setting up a pillar that enables your organization to understand what data means uniformly across all your teams. When we think about this curated information, you kind of take out that manual component where one person, maybe in accounting, knows how to interpret all these numbers and make them aligned. Rather, everyone in your organization who's accessing this information knows what it means. Pillar 3 is what we refer to as intelligent insights. So let's say you have good curated data and your infrastructure allows it to be easy to get to. When we talk about intelligent insights, we want to understand how enabled your users are to get useful insights and information out of the data that is available to them. For example, are there proven KPIs that everyone in your organization knows, understands, and monitors? Or are there only a handful of analysts equipped to answer the questions about what's really happening? Again, this goes to the idea of you're democratizing your information. You're taking that specialized knowledge out of the heads of the few and making sure that everyone can understand the data that's available to them. Pillar 4 is evidence-based decisions and actions. So once you've received your insights from your vetted data, how are you acting on them? Do you truly let the data drive all of your business decisions, or do you have key stakeholders or influencers who actually have latitude to override or even modify the data's conclusions based on their intuitions or gut feelings? That latter scenario is a characteristic of an organization that's probably more emergent or still developing in their data-driven journey, because in a fully optimized data-driven organization, those gut feelings, those intuitive decisions that aren't based or don't align with data are greeted with more skepticism. And finally, pillar 5 is data culture. And I mentioned data culture in the last slide, but it's very important, something that bears a lot of emphasis, because even if you have the most mature and sophisticated organization possible with regards to those 4 other pillars, if a data-driven philosophy is not bought into and evangelized from the top of your organization all the way down to the front lines, then you're never going to be able to truly realize all the benefits that being a true data-driven organization can unlock, because people won't be looking for those tangible benefits that you can really get to when you're a fully optimized data-driven organization. So I've been talking about phases of maturity and assessing your current state, things of that nature. This slide right here kind of looks to give you a high-level overview of how we kind of look at each of the pillars of a data-driven organization and how we assess them through these 3 phases of maturity. You can think of these phases more like a gradient than actual stair steps. You can easily be somewhere in between 2 phases. But applying these lenses of maturity to kind of assess how data-driven your organization is, it's simply a tool to help you drive decisions on how you can become more data-driven or how you can start to become data-driven. Our least mature phase is what we call the heavy lifting phase. So the name for this phase doesn't really roll off the tongue, but we find it's incredibly accurate. People who are in the heavy lifting phase, or organizations that are in the heavy lifting phase, they'll know they're in it because it will feel like every data-centric activity involves an extremely heavy lift. In this phase, analysts are often spending most of their time simply acquiring the data. And then once they get that data, they're spending even more time just shaping the data, getting it into the right state or shape so they can do their analysis. So how many of you can empathize with the idea of an analyst being asked to carry out an analysis? Then they go back and forth with IT just to get a data extract. And then once they get that data extract, they pull it into Excel, and they do a bunch of VLOOKUPs and pivot tables. And all of that data manipulation is simply to get the data to a point where they can finally do an analysis, right? This is what we're referring to when we say heavy lift. If you're an analyst, you want access to data that you can act on immediately. You should not have to take all of the data engineering steps manually, nonetheless, to get it to a point where you can get insights out of it. This type of environment is often the result of difficult to access data that's coming from different systems that have never coalesced. Analyses that are done in this phase, they're often very error prone, again, because I brought up that manual component that adds such a risk of error. But there's also a risk associated with all of the knowledge on how to conduct those manual analyses. All that knowledge lives in the heads of the analysts who are doing those analyses, right? If there are 12 steps they have to take in Excel just to make the data something that they can analyze, if they ever change roles or are no longer in that analyst role, they take all that information with them. And then there's subsequent costs to training new people, helping them understand these manual steps. All of this can be bypassed as soon as you begin to become more data-driven. Organizations who are in this heavy lifting state of maturity, who decide to focus on installing a data culture in conjunction with a centralized data infrastructure, are quickly going to move out of the heavy lifting phase and into the emergent phase. In the emergent phase, organizations truly begin to see the benefits of being data-driven. What often happens, or how this often plays out, is 1 or 2 high visibility data initiatives lead a lot of other functional leaders to say, hey, I want that too, that's so cool, right? And seeing those 1 or 2 successful data initiatives leads to more funding for data initiatives throughout your organization, which then leads to exponential growth in data-driven adoption. This is going to expand your data culture organically because people are going to start using these tools once they see the value. And it's going to lead to initiatives to implement more sophisticated data infrastructure, such as centralized data warehouses, as well as things like information servers, like centralized dashboards that'll provide on-demand access to these curated data sets and analytics. Now, this is all great, but there's also a very real risk of burnout in the emergent phase. You get caught up in it's very possible at least, to get caught up in all the enthusiasm to quickly become a more data-driven organization, that many organizations will actually fall into this trap of biting off more than they can chew. So when you're in this emergent phase, the really important thing is for stakeholders and leaders to stay mindful of being tempted by all of the data solutions and all the whole game of what if, right? The art of the possible. If they need to be wary of being caught up in all of that so that their organization doesn't get overwhelmed into inaction. You have a finite number of people and resources to implement these initiatives. So it's important to plan your growth throughout and ultimately out of the emergent phase with a pragmatic approach and by setting realistic short, medium, and long-term goals as far as your data-driven organization goals are concerned. And finally, in an optimized phase, you have a fully functioning self-service analytics platform. You have central data sources and well-defined and understood data dictionaries. You're in that state where everyone can get to data, everyone knows what it means, right? These environments are ideally going to be easily accessible with appropriate information restrictions to all members of your organization. But in particular, it needs to be easily accessible and consumable by stakeholders, decision makers, and frontline workers alike. Culturally, an optimized data-driven organization has accepted data as the driving force behind all operations and business decisions. So again, I'm not going to go into great detail on each of these pillars and what their characteristics are in terms of the phases of becoming a data-driven organization. I would also refer you to Becoming Data-Driven Organization, that webcast again, but I would like to kind of give you an idea of what the characteristics of an optimized data-driven organization are with regards to each of these 5 pillars. From an infrastructure perspective, once you're optimized, you'll begin to see numerous pre-built tools and data sources, such as data warehouses and real-time dashboards, which enable access for users who need that data. And they can get to that data without the need for deep technical knowledge, right? So someone doesn't need to know SQL to get data out of your data warehouse. Someone doesn't need to know R in order to conduct a detailed analysis. These measures, these things are set up in the infrastructure and the curated data to enable them to access the results right away and then ask questions of that result and do their own analysis and reach actionable conclusions more quickly. Curated data in an optimized environment means that key measures, KPIs, and analytics are all validated, and they can be provided to users directly on demand. This curated data, as you probably understood, works lockstep with your data infrastructure. So when both are optimized, users who seek answers to questions that are generated by the curated measures can easily go to your infrastructure and drill into the detailed data to ask more questions. An optimized intelligent insights phase uses advanced statistical models to provide users with more accurate and detailed predictive and prescriptive analytics, which will drive future actions in the path forward for your organization. In this optimized phase, you're also using diagnostic and descriptive analytics, which are easily monitored and enable quick access to corrective actions via alerts that are sent to them. Again, setting thresholds for KPIs and getting alerts when something skews outside of the acceptable range. These are all characteristics of an optimized data-driven organization from an intelligent insights perspective. An optimized data culture, and this bears repeating again because of how important culture is, it includes embedded data analysts or data acumen in all key business processes. So every team within your organization, whether they're working directly with financial data or whether it's purely operational data, they all understand the importance of data. Ideally, they have embedded analysts, but if not, when I say data acumen, they have people in their team who know their way around the data. All your employees throughout your organization are aware of how to access data, what it means, and they're provided training on how to use all those data tools. It's also very clear to them who they need to ask questions of when questions about the data come up. This optimized data culture goes hand in hand with an optimized evidence-based decision-making pillar, which is characterized by the need to support all decisions and data to support all decisions with data. As well as what I mentioned earlier, that increased skepticism of gut feeling decisions. So I hope this gives you kind of an idea of what the characteristics of optimized data-driven organizations are. But you're probably asking now, okay, that's great. How do I become a data-driven organization? So any organization at any state of maturity has a path forward toward becoming more enabled as a data-driven organization. This path forward starts with an assessment of your organization's current state with regards to being data-driven. So whether you use this framework and phases that I just described, or you use some other method of assessing your current state, the important part is being factual and honest about your current state of being a data-driven organization. Understanding what your current capabilities are, as well as where your shortcomings exist, is going to help you better understand where your opportunities are. For example, if you currently have multiple business processes housed in disparate systems whose data is rarely, if ever, combined and never validated against each other, then your next logical step with regards to your data infrastructure becoming more data-driven is not going to be that optimized step of setting up a self-service data environment. What you want to do first is get to that more emergent phase where you're defining your sources of truth and combining that information into a central repository. Then once you have that central repository, you can begin to focus on making that a self-service environment. Once you've identified your opportunities, the next step is building a prioritized roadmap to address each opportunity and gap, and then to execute on that roadmap pragmatically. You need to set realistic goals and milestones, and then you also need to kind of practice what you preach, right? With this data-driven organization philosophy, you should be using data and analytics to monitor your progress toward becoming more data-driven. What's important here as well is to make sure you establish a steering committee or some other oversight body, and make sure that that committee contains key stakeholders so that they can drive accountability and progress against your roadmap and plan. Importantly, you need to consider the benefits and what you hope to get out of being a data-driven organization, what the true value of being a data-driven organization is going to be to your organization, and consider measuring those values against possible incentives to drive implementation and adoption of your data-driven strategy. If you honestly assess your current state and you stick to that realistic roadmap based on your key data opportunities, you're going to be well on your way to being a more data-driven organization in no time. And to kind of give you an example of how we've helped some teams become more data-driven or implement sort of data-driven initiatives, we're going to dive into a few case studies now, and I'll hand it back off to Aaron to take you through the first one. Aaron?
Thank you, Angelo. And our first case study is going to be on rural telephone companies. And as we move into the case studies, I think that you'll see some of the threads of what Angelo was talking about presented here. And this rural telephone company project we've been doing for about the last year has been really interesting. Myself and another one of our teammates have been working on that. And what we're doing is trying to create a visual analytics platform for those companies so we can help them to deploy a set of complicated dashboards quickly. And these folks are hard at work every day, laying fiber optic cables, and they're trying to run service to as many people as quickly as possible. And the picture that we met when we joined this project was that you have a CFO or a GM who's out in one of these mid-sized companies. They have 40, 50, 60 employees. They have maybe hundreds of square miles of space. And they're really, the heart of the business is really trying to get the wire hung on the poles or run in the ground as quickly as possible. They have limited number of resources, and they have maybe 8 or 10 employees who work the central office, either answering phones or as accountants. And this industry is at a turning point right now where the regulatory rules are changing in favor of laying fiber and away from running telephone service. You have a lot of staff that's been in the industry for 20, 30, 35 years, and they're getting ready to retire. The technology is changing very dramatically at the same time, and this is all creating a lot of pressure. And that pressure is reports to regulators, putting more fiber in service, getting that fiber run to the places where it can be as efficient as possible, it can gain the most profit possible. There are government subsidies available for limited times on certain things. And there's typically high-cost legacy employee benefits plans. So there's a lot going on in this space, and these folks are really busy. And this really favors an environment where we can help them to do more with less time or do more quickly. And in this case, this is a good case model for using a modern visual analytics tool like Power BI or Tableau. And the reason for that is that they have a really robust, well-established ERP system already. And those ERP systems are fairly complicated. There's a lot of different modules that can generally handle capturing, storing, and retrieving the data for most of what that business needs. That's the good news. The bad news is that they're not super user-friendly, and they're not generally very flexible. And some of these ERP systems have visual analytics, and those are also typically not very flexible. The systems are really good at generating standard reports. So if you needed a fairly straightforward answer, or you needed an income statement or balance sheet, those are generally no problems, and the system can pretty much come up with that in a few minutes. But when you look to add more context, or you look to cut into that data and see what a specific part of your company is doing, or what a specific geography is doing, or customer type, it gets really difficult. And what this caused was the creation of all sorts of little teeny solutions. So we had, generally speaking, we had folks grabbing data out of the system, putting it into a spreadsheet, and then trying to color in the context that they needed. And they were doing this essentially as a one-off or manually every time. And there are some tools that can help you connect spreadsheets to data, but Power BI and Tableau are a little bit more efficient at this. They help you save time, because once you've connected it and you've created a tested dashboard environment, that is going to continue to operate fairly normally until something really big changes in the database, which is fairly rare. So they can help you get a lot better access to the data that you already have. It's your data after all. They can minimize mistakes, because you're not going to be going through this manual woven process in the spreadsheet. And they can save time also, because you're essentially putting all the answers into one location. So you have kind of a landing page and then a handful of dashboards. And what that allows you to do is to go to that one source of truth model, where you know that the answer is here, and you're not going to have to go look for the latest copy of the report and then check the dates or anything like that. It's a little bit faster once it's installed than the ERP system. And the reason for that is, when we build these things, we're having the data refresh when we're not at work. So it's typically going to look at refreshing in the morning before you come to work, and that's going to allow it to be updated all day long. It's not going to have to generate the report when you ask for it. It's going to already know that answer. And what this is going to give you is that ability to have better situational awareness. So you're going to have a lot more things on one page than you would typically have access to in a spreadsheet. And it gives you a lot of context. So in this case, we're looking at the finance dashboard. Each of those colors up there are different divisions of the company. You can also look at the bottom and see customers, which are broken down by customer type. So if you wanted to look at your business as a function of your residential customers, you can do that, and it gives you that ability to slice the data very precisely, very, very quickly, and that would be a much larger lift in Excel. And of course, with all visual analytics, it's going to give you that ability to just see trends and outliers and variations a lot faster. And so as we move to the next slide, what you're going to see, and I'm going to go back and forth a little bit here, is that one of the other things that these tools enable that's really beneficial is that it allows you to plumb in multiple data sources into the same sheet. And so going back again to customers, you're going to see that we've built a dashboard mostly out of the general ledger, but we've also added customer data from the ERP. So that gives a lot more context. You can see if your expenses and revenue are really going up as a function of growth in customers, or if it's something else. Going back to this plant dashboard example, you have several things here that are built on the general ledger, but you also have several things that are built from something else. And in this case, this group had really great data outside of their database that we were able to incorporate. So total fiber miles, we have census tract data, we have maps, which unfortunately aren't shown here, but you have that ability to add greater context. And linking these all together, what we found was that this was a really productive system for them. And some of those benefits were that it could also be automatic. And we didn't really think about that necessarily at the beginning, but what we found was that it saved quite a bit of time to have the system create the reports on its own. We knew that certain people were spending a lot of time creating reports, usually in Excel. and it kind of eliminated a lot of that work and allowed those people to focus on more value-added tasks. But it also had other implications. We had one client, and she came to us and said, hey, I really need to know these 6 things. As soon as I show up in the morning, it helps me allocate my time for the day. And we were able to create, kind of go through the reports we had built for her already and create a separate file that cherry-picked the data she needed out, and it emails her the update at 6 a.m. These systems can also send you alerts. I don't think we set a whole lot of those up, but it is totally possible. And we had another client that we worked with that said they saved 40 to 80 hours a month by building a rather elaborate trial balance module. And it wouldn't necessarily hit 0, but what it did was it knew the rules the previous month, and it would attempt the trial balance. And then it would, of course, miss, but it would show people right away, these are the things I can't figure out. And so you knew that you had transactions that were more rare, or they were entry mistakes or something like that, and you could go through and correct those. And it saved them a lot of overtime hours because it really helped them to direct their workers effectively. And so circling back into what does this mean in the current COVID distributed work environment? Well, the one source of truth was really helpful, and all of our clients in this space had some folks who did go to a distributed work environment, and having one place to go look was really helpful for them. And they were telling us that it was nice to be able to get on and get access to the report. And one of the things that I don't think anybody saw coming is, in some cases, when you take your laptop out of your office network, you lose connection to the database, and it has to be reconnected. That can be a fairly lengthy process to get it set up the first time. And it was really nice to have these automatic dashboards because they exist inside of that environment, and they can post that answer to the cloud, and you can get on your phone or a tablet or your laptop certainly and look at them kind of regardless of where you are. And so that helped a lot of our clients to save some time. And they also found kind of this other tangent of information, which was we had built them some dashboards, and they were kind of monthly, refreshes typically in this particular example. And so they knew them, they liked them. That wasn't really the issue. What was interesting was somebody came with a kind of an emergent question, and they wanted an answer now. And the folks that were our clients didn't necessarily think the dashboard had the answer, but they knew that the dashboard had all the information they needed. So they went into the system we had built for them, and they looked at the data source, and they were able to create the answer that they needed really quickly. And they liked it well enough to either have us incorporate it or to build their own ad hoc dashboard. So it really helped to create this rapid response to data. So those are kind of those becoming more resilient things that we're seeing as a result of these more automatic tools. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angelo for our second case study, and encourage everybody to put your questions in the window.
That all of your So, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So Aaron provided a great example of how companies can use data to help manage their financial reporting and monitoring. But it's also important to remember that all of your organizational data is important and has inherent value, whether it's financial or not, right? So we know that the main topic of this presentation is financial data analytics, but we thought that it would be important to highlight how the importance of non-financial data to operational efficiency as well, because that also has direct ties to your organization's financial success. So as I mentioned earlier, there's usually 1 or 2 high visibility initiatives that will accelerate the adoption of a data-driven strategy at an organization. Oftentimes, those initiatives have a genesis in the finance org. But once those initiatives are successful, a data-driven culture spreads throughout your organization, which unlocks data-driven benefits for all of your teams. So bearing that in mind, the second case study kind of involved a high-impact project that we carried out that used no financial data at all. So in this particular case study, we helped the client to better understand the distribution of responsibilities throughout their organization, which helped them quantify something that they knew was a real problem, but were never able to capture the full story around until they got their hands around the data and what it was telling them. The result of this case study was not only an acute analysis that answered immediate questions, but it was also a tool that could live on as a continuous monitoring solution, and it could be revisited periodically with data refreshes to help answer continuing questions about staffing decisions and the organization structure. So the client in this case was a hospital network with roughly 11,000 employees and was doing about $3 billion in patient revenue. Our client stakeholders came to us with a question about how we could help them better frame what they knew to be an issue that was impacting operational efficiency, but was something that they were having very difficulty communicating in the absence of sort of hard data-based facts. In the absence of these facts, it was hard for them to get the initiative to fix this problem off the ground. Their question was how we could take their data around management responsibilities throughout their entire organization, from the top all the way out to the front lines, and help them tell the story of how operational efficiency could be enhanced if they redistributed responsibilities according to a concept called span of control. So span of control refers to an individual employee or a particular person, how many people they're responsible for. What you could think of it as maybe a sphere of influence, right? How many people they're responsible for overseeing. Span of control can manifest itself in different levels of separation. So you can talk about it through the lens of who your direct reports are, or who your second level reports are, or who your third level reports are, right? It goes all the way through your chain of command. But the important thing to remember is span of control measure ultimately stands in as a quantifiable proxy for management responsibility levels. When you think of many modern HR information system platforms, they have data models that can account for reporting relationships all the way down a chain of command. This particular client was mid-implementation on a new HR system, but they needed answers to these questions right now. In their current state, the HRIS platform they were using for tracking reporting relationships and management responsibilities was fully homegrown. It was fully built in-house, it had limited controls, and it really only tracked direct report to manager reporting relationships. There were some other parameters around this analysis where we couldn't access the data in their homegrown system directly, so we were only able to work with a limited set of flat file extracts that were provided at the employee level of detail. These extracts, while they contained a record for every employee, each record simply only listed an employee, a title, and an ID number, and then their supervisor and their supervisor's ID number. So knowing that we couldn't capture the full scope of any single individual span of control by looking only at who their direct reports were, our first step was to design a data model that took these flat files and then extrapolated entire chains of command all the way out to the front line for every single employee listed, right? This is where we start talking about how you get to an emergent phase or even an optimized phase on your data infrastructure and curating that information, right? We're building a data model that can take the raw data and transform it continuously and consistently beyond just this one analysis. Once we had that data model built, we wrote a SQL stored procedure, or a series of SQL stored procedures, which automated the transformation of those flat file extracts into a much more complex data model, that data model that we designed. So while it took a significant level of effort to design and code the data model, we no longer had to go through that manual process of cleaning those file extracts every time they had to be updated, because we had these stored procedures that simply went and found the new file and reshaped them according to what they needed to be shaped for analysis. This was a key foundational component of the success of this project, because once we began generating results and insights, we actually had to go through several iterations of those data sets and file extracts every week. And anytime they had to refresh the information, anytime we needed to get a new set of data files, our analysis was updated and refreshed in 15 to 20 minutes. And so speaking of analytics, once we had that data model built, we were able to focus fully on the results that it was giving us. So while our initial impetus for the project was to simply calculate out the spans of controls for all individuals with management responsibilities, the time that we invested in building that data infrastructure for the data model and curating the span of control analytics, it led us to have an ability and flexibility within that budget to answer questions or to focus on questions that needed answering that were generated by the analytics that we were automating. So for example, we noted extremely high spans of control for certain individuals. There were some managers in this org who had direct report responsibilities in numbering over 100 direct reports, right? There were also managers at the same levels who had 3 or less direct reports. We took that population and we broke it down and showed it to them visually. We broke it into quartiles and showed them the bottom 25% of everyone who had management responsibilities only had 3 or less direct reports, whereas the top 25% of people with management responsibilities were overseeing 50 plus people. It helped them understand better what the distribution was and sort of infer what the impact would be on those people who were being managed. And then we turned these observations and analytics into actionable stories by applying basic statistical methods to highlight the populations of management who, compared to their peers, should consider having their management responsibilities redistributed, as well as the managers who could stand and have the bandwidth to accept that redistribution. Going the other way, we were able to turn our data around and identified individual contributors who may not be receiving the same amount of guidance that they need to be successful at their jobs, simply by virtue of the fact that their manager had too many people to make sure they were taken care of. So the outcome of this project was a product that was able to confirm, using data, something that C-suite stakeholders had long suspected, but for which they were unable to fully articulate an impetus for action, right? This is kind of the opposite of what I said earlier, where you shouldn't really, in a data-driven organization, just act on instinct. It should be validated by data, right? And so gut feelings, they were experiencing that. Their thought that we need to fix this problem, but couldn't back it up with data. There was skepticism of that. And so we were able to bring that to bear through this analysis, through this work product, to show what the real problems were. This analysis, this hard data, was the missing piece of their value proposition for the initiative that would ultimately lead to reorganization. They were able to demonstrate how many people could stand to benefit at all levels across all teams from an organizational restructure and redistribution of management responsibilities. So in addition to highlighting the problem and the need for action, it also helped them to plan their corrective actions, as I mentioned, because it highlighted the populations that could stand to benefit immediately and most significantly. Finally, the tool produced a valuable report, but the tool itself persists as a valuable method for re-evaluating their efforts against their original goals. As I mentioned, it's easy to refresh with new data, it's easy to revisit at any point in time, and the results will be calculated consistently. So they can use it to answer future questions around whether or not their initiatives as a result of this were effective in reducing workload, and if they positively impacted factors such as operational effectiveness and employee retention. So when you think about how this project, it did take place prior to COVID, but that data model still exists post-COVID, and it could easily be leveraged into something that could take a look at all the managers and where their frontline workers live, say all nurses, all frontline medical staff. If they're looking at how to respond to a surge in patient cases as a result of COVID-19 outbreaks in their area, they quickly know exactly who to contact to get approval, who has availability and bandwidth to be moved to a hospital location or an ER that perhaps needs more support. They can have those conversations right away, and it enables them to enhance their change agility in the face of something like this COVID outbreak or other unexpected events in our business environments. So this is just one way in which creating curated information in an optimized data environment can allow an organization to unlock these new levels of change agility in light of unforeseen circumstances. And I hope both of these examples and both of these case studies kind of gave you a better idea of the value that can come from focusing on being more data-driven. And with that, I believe we can open it up a little bit more for questions for Aaron and I.
Okay, we have one question about how do you handle data that might not be available until after the books are closed, since it includes journal entries and reconciliations? And there's a lot to unpack here, but kind of my first take on this coming out of the telco experience is that once entries are made in the general ledger, they're available. And so the first piece, I guess, is that it's possible to build tools in most cases that can sample that data as it happens. And I mean, we built ours to refresh daily, but that's not necessarily the way it needs to be. You could set it up so that you could just push a button and have it refresh a course. And that'll allow you to look at that stuff much more rapidly. So you can kind of see things coming. You can see maybe coding mistake being made on a day-to-day basis. And then once you do get to that reconciliation and closeout period, an automatic data system is going to give you the ability to kind of sort through problems and come to solutions a lot faster. And if not for no other reason than it's kind of a pre-built, pre-tested system. So it's going to do a lot of the work that in the past we would have done with Excel. It's going to just do it a lot faster. And I hope that answers the question. And if there are any other questions, please put them into the chat window. And so that's going to be the little call out button in the bottom bar if you mouse over the center of the screen.
Yeah, and Aaron, if I could add something there as well.
Sure.
So when we think about data that might not be available until after books are closed, right? We also want to kind of think about when you're handling that. I think, Aaron, what you said, using the data that you already have to kind of extrapolate what it means. That's a great way of doing some sort of maybe predictive analytic, right? But you also want to think about how you're planning to use that data. So when we talk about data that is not available until post close, are you trying to use that data to come to an answer right now? Because until the event has happened, right, you're not going to be able to see concretely what did occur. But if you're talking about how do you access data that's not available until post-close, and how being a data-driven organization can accelerate processes that rely on that, if we think about your standard financial close process, right, if you go to kind of more of a heavy lifting organization, and something I've seen there is that they basically have close week, like the week after a month end. And during that week, there's a month end plus one, month end plus two, referring to days after month end. And they have this whole list of job aids that they have to take care of based on data availability. And they need time to execute those actions once that data is available. When you focus on becoming more data driven and your data infrastructure around these journal entries is mature, and you have curated information available around that, you compact that close timeline, right? Whereas getting through an entire close report may currently take a full week. If you bypass all of that waiting time and all of that processing time just to reconcile the data, then once the books are closed, the right data infrastructure will serve the final answers out to everybody on the day of close. So you might not be able to access that data before close, but once it closes, everyone has their final report within hours, right? Minutes. So that's kind of one way to handle that data. And then if you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I compare the month end close from 2 months ago to today, but with the information as it was at that cutoff date, then you start talking about things like snapshots, where you may have you may take a snapshot of data at a certain point in time, so you can look at exactly what that close report looked like when it was run. So those are other things to consider. It really depends on how you're planning to use the data.
All right, and we have a second question, which is about common mistakes with data, either in storage or tracking. And I think looking again at the telco space and at some of our other clients, I don't know that I'd say that there's really like a wrong way to do that. That's not really a helpful way to look at it. Everybody's in a different place on their data journey. And the importance is, you know, as you look around to improve your position and take the next step as you can. And so what we have seen that's been troubling is a very large company that evolved over time and grew. And they grew using really complicated spreadsheet models. And at some point, those just can't process the data quickly enough. Or in one case, I think, you know, we had a client who had an employee that spent 37 to 40 hours a week refreshing a spreadsheet model. And, you know, that's not wrong. I kind of poo-pooed spreadsheets a little bit in this, but, you know, you can develop solutions in a spreadsheet really quickly and at a low cost. But eventually, for some of these things, it's worth investing in a more automatic system, because if you're spending more on the employee's time to do that, you're losing their ability to do other things for you or other value-added analysis. So, you know, at some point, it's good to kind of get beyond that system and to do it in a flexible manner. And so we've kind of, put Tableau and Power BI up in that group right now in this presentation. And there are other solutions, of course, but it is helpful to have the flexibility, right? Like there are a lot of solutions out there, and a lot of them are even pre-baked, but having a really flexible solution like Power BI or Tableau to go with your data system or your spreadsheets is really helpful, because you can ask it new questions. So, we can come in and we could install a really complicated set of dashboards for you. And if you have additional questions, we can build onto that. You can build onto that. And it's easy to take those next steps in the journey. And as Angelo mentioned, it's also really important to think about, to take kind of a step back and take a 10,000 foot view and just think about like how you want to move and kind of set out a plan. And that's a year's process in a lot of cases. So looking at like, what do we want to accomplish this year with our data, and kind of allocating budget. And I've been to a lot of different classes that kind of highlight one thing, which is you get what you resource. And if you're not resourcing your data, it's going to be really hard for people to make improvements there. So, at some point, it's important to resource a data organization that kind of can steer you forward and say, hey, we'd like to make these improvements. We'd like to see a data warehouse. We'd like to see the use of some visuals and stuff like that. And that's kind of the way forward. And Angelo, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it pretty well. One thing that I would say is kind of a point I tried to make earlier, though. A common mistake is oftentimes when you're trying to figure out how to most efficiently manage and store your data, there is that risk of putting the cart before the horse, right? If you're trying to get to a centralized data warehouse, but you don't even know where all your systems are, how to define the data that's in them, you're not going to be successful in that endeavor. So you really need to think about when you're planning your strategies around how you're handling your data, that you kind of make sure you're taking the next best step logically based on your current state. So I think we're looking at
we have a third question now. And we're at time right now, but we're able to stay on and keep answering questions as they come through. And for folks who have to run, you can feel free to reach out to us. We do little projects where we go and take a look under the hood and see what you have, a data assessment, if you will. And those can be a really good way to get started as well. And for those sticking around, we're happy to start answering additional questions for as long as it takes. And Angelo, did you want to start with question number 3?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, we are at the start of the road to develop electronically stored data. Is it your experience that electronically stored data facilitates data-driven efforts? And I think, depending on the context here, if you're talking about going from paper file storage to electronic storage, then the answer is 1,000% yes, right? Because when you get into a place where you're storing your data electronically or digitally, you're going to access it more quickly. You're also able to make sure that it's clean and makes sense. Because when you set up a centralized data environment, you can enforce integrity rules and validation procedures so that, pieces of data aren't appearing where they shouldn't. You're not going to get a first name appearing in a middle name column. You're not going to get a zip code appearing in a phone number field, right? So there's so many benefits just off the bat that come with moving toward electronically stored data. Now, if we're talking about maybe going from a on-premises data server to something in the cloud, there's a lot of cost-benefit analysis that needs to be going on there, and helps you understand whether or not you're ready or will benefit from a cloud-based solution. Oftentimes, the answer is going to skew toward yes, but again, that's a case where you really want to dive into the assessment that you've made of your organization, what your capabilities are, where your goals lie, and then make the decision there based on what the cost of that electronic solution is. So yeah, that would be my summary. Paper to electronic, absolutely. On-prem to cloud, probably, but depends. And Aaron, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's kind of the heart of a lot of things. And again, it kind of depends on where you are in your journey. But it's always good to look at what's next and kind of plan for it ahead of time. And so, if you're talking about jumping from, spreadsheets to something, more robust, you can definitely get value out of that. And there's a lot of other neat things in this space, and I'm going to take a second here just to mention RPA tools, and there's a lot of those out there, and these are essentially, macros on steroids that can do all sorts of things, including read receipts and stuff like that for you. And I'm not really going to dive into that too much more, other than to just say that there are some new things coming, and they could save you a lot more time with automation if you have a good use case for them. And again, that's something you have to look at on a company basis, and we're happy to come talk with you about it and the realities of whether or not it's a good value for you. And I'm not seeing any other questions. I think a lot of people are going to run out of time, and we thank everybody for joining us. I'd like to turn it back over to Deanna if there are no other questions.
All right, looks like we are finished with the questions. Thank you so much, Aaron and Angelo. This presentation will be emailed to you in the next couple of days, as well as a link to the recording. The recording will also be available on mossadams.com within a few days. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.